You were just our maid. How could you possibly save this family? You never knew who you were asking to leave.
Elena, I should have trusted you.
Rain fell over Manhattan like the city itself was mourning something it hadn't lost yet. And on the 40th floor of a glass tower that pierced through the storm clouds, Margaret Whitfield sat inside a boardroom that felt colder than the weather outside. Her hands, once so steady when she ruled over dinner tables and family decisions alike, now trembled as she stared at a woman seated across from her. The woman wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that spoke of quiet, unquestionable power, and the storm outside blurred her face behind streaks of rain sliding down the window. On the table between them lay a single contract, the only thing standing between the Whitfield family name and complete collapse. Margaret's eyes moved slowly from the woman's steady hand to the signature drying on the page, and in that instant, 6 months of buried guilt rose to the surface all at once. She whispered a name she never thought she would speak again. Elena. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The woman said nothing. She simply watched Margaret's face crumble in real time. The way a person watches a storm they once caused finally reach their own front door. 6 months earlier, this same woman had been ordered out of the Whitfield estate with nothing but a suitcase and a folded apron, treated as though her presence had been an embarrassment the family could no longer afford. Tonight, she was the only person standing between them and ruin, holding a decision in her hands that could either save the Whitfield name or let it disappear forever, and she had not yet decided which one she wanted. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence in that boardroom stretched longer than any argument ever could, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass, as though the building itself was counting down to whatever Elena would say next. To understand how a housekeeper once dismissed without a second thought now held the fate of an entire empire in her hands, we have to go back. Not to the boardroom, not to the contract, but to a quiet Connecticut morning 6 months earlier, when nobody in the Whitfield family had any reason to believe their world was about to change forever. Daniel Whitfield woke before sunrise that day, the way he always did, in a small guest house on the edge of his family's sprawling estate, separate from the main house both physically and emotionally. He was 34 years old, the youngest son of one of the wealthiest families in the state, yet he lived like a man trying to disappear from his own inheritance. Where his older brother Preston thrived on boardrooms and business deals, Daniel had walked away from the family company 2 years earlier after a breakdown nobody in his family ever fully acknowledged, choosing instead to run a small architecture practice that barely covered his bills but let him breathe. That morning, as mist rolled low across the lawn and the scent of wet grass drifted through his open window, Daniel noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. A woman moving quietly across the terrace of the main house, carrying folded linens with a kind of care that seemed almost out of place for the task. Her name was Elena Reyes, and she had worked as a housekeeper for the Whitfield estate for nearly a year, yet Daniel realized, almost with embarrassment, that he had never once had a real conversation with her. She moved through the house like someone who belonged to it more than the family who owned it, correcting a younger housekeeper's mistake with quiet patience instead of irritation, never raising her voice, never seeking praise for the things she did well. There was a stillness to her that felt earned rather than shy, the kind of calm that made people curious without knowing exactly why. It was later that same week when Daniel first noticed something in Elena that would stay with him far longer than he expected. A small bird had fallen from its nest near the garden wall, its wing bent at an angle that made it clear it could no longer fly. Most people would have walked past it without a second thought, but Elena knelt down immediately, wrapped the trembling creature gently inside a folded dish towel, and carried it against her chest for the rest of the day. checking on it quietly between chores as though it mattered more than anything else on her schedule. Daniel watched from a distance, saying nothing, but something in him shifted. It wasn't attraction in the obvious sense, not yet. It was closer to recognition, the feeling of noticing someone the rest of the world had overlooked simply because she never asked to be noticed in the first place. Over the following weeks, small moments built quietly between them, the kind neither of them would have called meaningful at the time. Though looking back, they were the beginning of everything. Elena taught him a handful of words in Spanish while folding laundry near the back porch, laughing softly at his terrible pronunciation. Daniel, in return, spent an afternoon fixing the stubborn window in her second-hand car that refused to roll up properly, getting his hands greasy in a way none of his family would have approved of. When he asked her, almost carelessly, about her life before working at the estate, she gave him a small, practiced smile and changed the subject with a line that would echo in his memory far longer than she probably intended. Everyone has a before, Daniel. Some of us just don't visit it. At the time, he thought it was simply modesty. He had no idea how much truth was hiding behind those words. Not everyone in the Whitfield family was blind to what was happening. Harold Whitfield, Daniel's father and the aging patriarch of the family business, noticed the change in his youngest son long before anyone else did, and unlike the rest of the family, he did not see it as a problem. Harold had spent decades building an empire, and in doing so, had made mistakes he rarely spoke of, mistakes that weighed on him more heavily now that his health had begun to fail. Watching Daniel smile more easily, seem lighter, more like himself, stirred something quiet and protective in Harold, a feeling he chose not to question too closely. Preston, on the other hand, noticed the same change and reacted with a very different instinct, one shaped less by concern and more by the discomfort of watching his brother find peace in a life Preston had always privately dismissed as beneath their family standing. One evening, after a tense family dinner where Preston made a pointed comment about Daniel spending too much time near the help, Daniel found himself standing outside near the old greenhouse at the edge of the property, the same place he had wandered to as a child whenever the main house felt too loud, too demanding, too much like a stage he never wanted to perform on. Elena was there too, tending quietly to a row of neglected plants that no one else in the family had bothered to notice in years. Something about the fading light, the smell of damp soil, and the comfortable silence between them made the moment feel different from every other conversation they'd had before. Daniel didn't plan what happened next, and that, more than anything, was exactly why it felt real. He simply told her, without rehearsal, that being near her was the only time he felt like himself anymore, and asked, almost too quietly to hear over the evening breeze, if she would consider spending her life with him. For a long moment, Elena said nothing at all, and in that silence, something flickered across her face that Daniel would only understand the true meaning of many months later. It wasn't hesitation born of doubt about her feelings for him. It was something closer to fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing a truth the other person doesn't, and wondering whether saying yes would only delay the moment that truth finally came out. She looked at him for a long time, studying his face as though searching for permission to trust him completely, before finally answering with a quiet and steady yes that neither of them fully understood the weight of yet. Neither of them could have known, standing there in that dimly lit greenhouse with the scent of earth and rain in the air, that this single moment of hope would soon collide with a family determined to destroy it, or that the woman he had just proposed to was carrying a secret far larger than either of them could imagine. News of the engagement did not stay quiet for long, and it was Diane, Preston's wife, who made certain of that. Diane had never trusted Elena from the very beginning, not out of any real reason she could name, but out of the kind of suspicion that wealthy families often direct toward anyone who enters their world without a name attached to it. She had spent weeks quietly asking questions, watching Elena a little too closely, And when she finally learned of the engagement, she wasted no time delivering the news to Margaret over brunch, wrapped in false concern, but dripping with satisfaction underneath. Margaret's reaction was immediate and cold, the kind of anger that did not raise its voice, but instead tightened every muscle in her face. She had spent her entire life building the Whitfield name into something respected, and the idea that her son intended to marry a woman who cleaned their floors felt, to her, like a threat to everything she had worked for. That following weekend, Margaret arranged what appeared on the surface to be a simple family dinner, but everyone at the table understood almost immediately that it was something else entirely. The dining room, usually a place of quiet formality, felt different that night, heavier, as though the walls themselves were bracing for conflict. Harold sat at the head of the table looking uneasy, aware of what was coming but unwilling to stop it. Preston wore a faint, almost amused expression, the look of a man who enjoyed watching other people's discomfort as long as it wasn't his own. Elena arrived beside Daniel dressed simply, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that unsettled Margaret more than any nervousness would have. Margaret wasted no time. Before the first course had even been served, she began asking pointed questions about Elena's family, her education, her background, each question sharper than the last. Elena answered every question honestly but briefly, refusing to give Margaret the emotional reaction she seemed to be hunting for. This only seemed to provoke Margaret further, and within minutes, the conversation shifted from questions to open judgment. Margaret spoke about reputation, about the family's standing in the community, about what people would say if word got out that Daniel intended to marry the household staff. She never once raised her voice, yet every word landed like a slap, calculated and deliberate. Daniel sat frozen, his jaw tight, clearly wanting to intervene but held back by years of conditioning that had trained him to avoid conflict with his mother at all costs. It was Elena, not Daniel, who finally broke the tension, speaking in a voice so steady it silenced the room entirely. "I clean your floors, Mrs. Whitfield. I didn't ask you to respect me. I asked you to let your son be happy." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Margaret had said all evening. For a brief moment, even Preston's smug expression faltered, and Harold lowered his eyes to his plate, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Margaret, however, did not back down. Instead, she turned to Daniel directly, her tone shifting from anger to something colder, something closer to a warning. She reminded him of everything the family had given him, the education, the opportunities, the safety net he had relied on more than he liked to admit, and asked him plainly whether he was truly willing to throw all of that away for a woman he had known for less than a year. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, to finally say something in Elena's defense, but the words caught in his throat. He glanced at Elena, hoping she would understand his silence as fear rather than agreement, but something in her eyes told him she had already understood far more than he wanted her to. That silence, more than anything Margaret had said, became the first real fracture in Daniel and Elena's relationship, not because Elena doubted his love, but because she now understood exactly how far he was willing to go to defend it. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to make up for that moment, apologizing repeatedly, promising it wouldn't happen again. But Elena remained quiet in a way that felt less like anger and more like careful observation, as though she were testing whether his words would eventually be followed by action. Despite the tension at home, the two of them moved forward with their plans, choosing a small courthouse wedding rather than the extravagant occasion Margaret would have insisted on for appearances alone. Harold, defying his wife's wishes for the first time in years, quietly attended the ceremony, standing near the back of the room with tears in his eyes that surprised even him. Margaret and Preston were nowhere to be seen. The wedding itself was small and unremarkable by Whitfield standards, yet it carried a kind of honesty their family had rarely witnessed. Elena wore a simple dress she had chosen herself, and Daniel stood before her with none of the nervous hesitation he had shown at the dinner table days earlier, as though finally, in that quiet courthouse room, he had nothing left to prove to anyone but her. But the peace did not last long. Within days of the wedding, Margaret made her disapproval felt in ways far more damaging than words. Elena was dismissed from her position at the estate without warning, her employment terminated under the thin excuse of conflict of interest. Around the same time, Daniel discovered that his monthly distribution from the family trust, a financial cushion he had quietly depended on more than he ever admitted to Elena, had been abruptly cut off, leaving them to face their new life together with far less security than either of them expected. It was during this period of quiet struggle that something strange happened, something Daniel noticed but did not think much of at the time. One evening, while unpacking boxes in their small rented apartment, Elena stepped outside abruptly to take a phone call, closing the door behind her with unusual urgency. Daniel, curious, moved closer to the window and caught fragments of her voice through the glass, speaking in rapid, precise language that sounded less like casual conversation and more like something formal, almost legal in nature. Terms he didn't recognize, a tone of authority he had never heard from her before. When she returned inside moments later, her expression had already smoothed back into its usual calm, and when he asked who had called, she simply said it was an old friend checking in. Daniel let the moment pass, unaware that he had just witnessed the very first crack in the secret Elena had been carrying since long before she ever met him. With no support from the family and Daniel's small architecture practice struggling more than ever, the couple settled into a modest rented apartment on the edge of town, far removed from the comfort either of them had once known. Daniel quickly discovered that his professional troubles ran deeper than simple bad luck. Clients who had once expressed interest in his designs suddenly stopped returning his calls, and contracts that seemed nearly. With no support from the family and Daniel's small architecture practice struggling more than ever, the couple settled into a modest rented apartment on the edge of town, far removed from the comfort either of them had once known. Daniel quickly discovered that his professional troubles ran deeper than simple bad luck. Clients who had once expressed interest in his designs suddenly stopped returning his calls, and contracts that seemed nearly finalized fell apart without explanation. It did not take long for him to understand that Margaret's influence extended far beyond the family dinner table, reaching into the social circles that controlled much of the local business world. Money grew tighter with each passing week. A shut-off notice arrived taped to their apartment door one afternoon, and their first wedding anniversary was spent quietly at home over a modest meal neither of them complained about, though the strain in their eyes told a different story than their smiles. While Daniel and Elena struggled to build a life on their own terms, tension inside the Whitfield company was quietly escalating in ways neither of them were aware of. Preston, feeling increasingly threatened by his father's declining health and unresolved questions about who would eventually lead the family business, began making a series of aggressive financial decisions meant to strengthen his position of control. He approved risky investments without proper review, brushed aside warnings from senior advisors, and convinced himself that decisive action, however reckless, would prove his readiness to lead. None of these decisions were visible to the public yet, hidden carefully behind confident press statements and controlled financial reports. But within the walls of the company, longtime employees exchanged uneasy glances every time Preston pushed through another deal too quickly for anyone to properly question. The foundation of the family's fortune, though no one recognized it yet, had already begun to weaken. The situation reached its breaking point when Harold suffered a sudden heart episode late one evening. Collapsing in his study just after reviewing a set of documents Preston had asked him not to look at too closely. He was rushed to the hospital, and for several agonizing hours, doctors were uncertain whether he would survive the night. Daniel arrived at the hospital immediately, guilt and fear written plainly across his face as he sat in the waiting room, replaying every unresolved argument he had ever had with his father. Margaret, overwhelmed with fear for her husband's life, directed her panic outward instead of inward, publicly blaming the stress of Daniel's marriage for contributing to Harold's collapse. When Elena arrived at the hospital to support her husband, Margaret personally instructed hospital staff not to allow her into the room, forcing Elena to wait alone in a cold hallway while the family gathered inside without her. That night became one of the most painful moments of their marriage so far, not because of anything dramatic that was said, but because of everything that was quietly endured. Elena sat for hours on a hard plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, watching nurses and doctors move past her without acknowledgement, while inside the room, a family that had never fully accepted her gathered around a man she genuinely respected. When Daniel finally stepped out to find her still waiting there, something in him broke open. He sank into the chair beside her and, for the first time since their wedding, allowed himself to fully break down, apologizing not just for that night, but for every moment he had failed to defend her, starting with the dinner where his silence had spoken louder than any insult his mother had thrown at her. Elena did not offer easy comfort. She simply held his hand and listened, her steadiness somehow deeper than the situation seemed to allow for. In the days following Harold's hospitalization, Margaret grew increasingly desperate, watching the company's foundation tremble under pressures she did not yet fully understand were largely Preston's doing. Convinced that removing what she saw as the source of the family's disgrace would somehow restore stability, she summoned Daniel for a private conversation that would test him more than any dinner table confrontation had before. She did not raise her voice this time. Instead, she spoke with a calm, calculated precision, presenting him with a choice disguised as concern for the family's survival. If he did not end his marriage to Elena, she informed him, she would ensure he was permanently removed from the family will, and more importantly, that any remaining support for his struggling business would disappear entirely, right as his father remained too weak to intervene on his behalf. The choice, as Margaret framed it, was simple: his wife or his family's future. What she never said aloud, and perhaps did not fully admit even to herself, was that the family's survival had far less to do with Daniel's marriage than it did with the mistakes already unfolding quietly behind closed doors. For days after Margaret's ultimatum, Daniel found himself unable to sleep, lying awake beside Elena while questions circled endlessly through his mind with no resolution in sight. He thought of his father, fragile and uncertain in a hospital bed, of the business that had employed generations of families in their town, of the trust fund that had quietly cushioned every hardship he'd ever faced without him fully realizing how much he depended on it. And then he thought of Elena, asleep beside him, unaware that his silence in that moment was not peace but agony. One evening, unable to bear the weight of his own thoughts, he drove out to the old greenhouse on the estate, now overgrown and forgotten, the same place he had once proposed to her. Standing among the dead plants and shattered glass panels, he searched for an answer that refused to come, torn between two versions of loyalty he could not reconcile. Preston, sensing his brother's hesitation, saw an opportunity to shape the outcome in his own favor. He approached Daniel not with hostility, but with the calm, persuasive tone of someone offering a reasonable compromise. He suggested, almost casually, that Daniel didn't need to fully end things with Elena, only distance himself from her publicly, protect the family name on paper, while quietly continuing whatever private relationship he wished to maintain behind closed doors. To Preston, this seemed like an easy solution, a way to satisfy their mother without truly sacrificing anything of value. He didn't understand, and perhaps never could, that for Daniel, the relationship had never been about appearances in the first place. Still, the suggestion planted a seed of doubt, a fragile hope that there might be some middle path that would spare him from choosing it all, even as every part of him understood deep down that no such path truly existed. What Daniel did not know was that Elena had already begun quietly investigating the truth behind the company's sudden financial instability, using contacts and resources no one in the Whitfield family believed a former housekeeper could possibly have access to. Through careful, discreet conversations, she learned that Preston's reckless deals, not her marriage to Daniel, were the true source of the crisis threatening to collapse everything Harold had spent his life building. Yet she also learned something else, something that struck her harder than any financial detail could. Margaret genuinely believed, however wrongly, that removing Elena from the family would somehow restore order, and Elena understood that as long as she remained visibly tied to Daniel, Margaret's fear and resentment would only continue to deepen, further poisoning any chance of Harold's company finding the support it desperately needed to survive. Slowly, quietly, an idea began to take root in her mind, one she chose not to share with Daniel just yet. One quiet evening, without warning or dramatic announcement, Elena sat Daniel down and told him, in the same calm and steady voice she had used the night of that painful family dinner, that she believed they should end the marriage, not because her feelings had changed, but because she could no longer watch him lose everything piece by piece while trying to hold on to her. Daniel argued, desperate, insisting there had to be another way, but Elena remained resolute, her decision already made long before she spoke the words aloud. She told him this wasn't defeat, but protection, a belief that stepping aside now would give him the chance to repair what remained of his relationship with his family and save the business that so many people depended on for their livelihoods. What Daniel could not see in that moment, blinded by heartbreak, was that Elena's sacrifice was not born of weakness or resignation, but of a plan already quietly forming behind her calm, unreadable expression. The day they signed the divorce papers arrived with the same gray, relentless rain that would later return the night everything changed inside that Manhattan boardroom, as though the sky itself remembered what was about to be lost. The lawyer's office was cold and sterile, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, the sound of rain tapping steadily against the windows the only thing filling the silence between them. Daniel's hand trembled as he held the pen, staring at the document as though sheer will alone might make the words disappear. Elena sat across from him, her posture straight, her face composed in the same careful stillness she had carried since the night of that first family dinner, betrayed only once by the faint clenching of her jaw before she steadied herself again. Neither of them spoke as the papers were signed. There were no dramatic declarations, no final embrace. Only two people quietly ending something neither of them truly wanted to end, for reasons far more complicated than either fully understood in that moment. In the weeks that followed the divorce, Daniel returned to the family estate expecting some measure of relief, some sign that his sacrifice had accomplished what his mother promised it would. Instead, he found only more excuses, more delays, more reasons why the support he had been promised remained just out of reach. Margaret spoke vaguely about giving it time and letting the family heal whenever he asked about the trust fund or renewed backing for his architecture practice, her tone shifting each time he pressed for specifics. Preston, meanwhile, grew increasingly evasive whenever business matters came up at family gatherings, quick to change the subject or excuse himself from the room entirely. Daniel began to notice, slowly and painfully, that the crisis Margaret had once framed as being caused by his marriage had never actually improved, despite the marriage being over. If anything, the tension in the household seemed to be growing worse, not better, though no one would explain exactly why. It was during a rare, unguarded moment with his father, who was recovering slowly but still weak from his hospitalization, that Daniel finally began to understand the truth. Harold, medicated and unusually candid, mentioned in passing his concern over several company decisions he vaguely remembered reviewing before his collapse. decisions he could no longer fully recall the details of. He mentioned Preston's name more than once, followed by a troubled expression he quickly tried to hide. Daniel left his father's room that day with a growing unease settling in his chest, a suspicion he wasn't ready to fully voice yet, but one he could no longer ignore. He began quietly asking questions of longtime employees he still trusted, people who had worked for his father for decades, and who, out of loyalty to Harold rather than fear of Preston, finally began speaking honestly about what had truly been happening inside the company. What Daniel uncovered over the following days left him staggered. Preston had approved a series of high-risk investments over the past year, decisions made hastily and without the careful oversight the company had always prided itself on. Contracts had been signed with partners whose reliability had never been properly vetted. Loans had been taken against assets that could not easily absorb another downturn, and warning signs from senior advisors had been dismissed or buried entirely. The financial strain Margaret had blamed on Daniel's marriage had, in truth, been building for over a year, driven almost entirely by his brother's reckless ambition to prove himself capable of leading the company before their father was even gone. Daniel sat with this knowledge for days, turning it over again and again, and the weight of it eventually gave way to a bitter, quiet clarity. He had given up the one honest relationship in his life for a family crisis that had never truly been his to fix in the first place. Word soon spread through the tightly connected world of private investors that the Whitfield company was quietly in far worse trouble than its public image suggested, and offers of rescue funding, when they came at all, arrived with conditions so severe they threatened to strip away everything Harold had spent his life building. Margaret grew increasingly desperate as one potential deal after another fell through, each rejection chipping away at the composure she had always worn like armor. It was during this period of mounting panic that word reached her of a private investment group known for its selectivity and near-total anonymity, operating under the name Reyes Alvarez Holdings, a firm that had recently expressed cautious interest in reviewing the Whitfield company's financial position. Details about the firm's leadership were almost impossible to find, its negotiations conducted entirely through a single attorney who revealed nothing beyond what was strictly necessary. Margaret, with no better options remaining, agreed to the meeting, unaware of how deeply that decision would soon unravel everything she believed she understood about her own family. The meeting was arranged for a rain-soaked evening in Manhattan, inside a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of a tower Margaret had never once visited before, chosen deliberately by the investment firm for reasons that would soon become clear. She arrived early, Preston at her side, both of them rehearsing careful explanations meant to reassure whoever they were about to meet that the company's troubles were manageable, temporary, nothing more than a rough patch in an otherwise strong legacy. When the door finally opened, a woman entered wearing a tailored navy suit, her posture composed, her expression unreadable in the dim light softened further by rain streaking steadily down the windows behind her. She said very little at first, allowing Margaret to speak, to explain, to plead her case with the same practiced confidence she had once used to dismantle Elena at that long-ago family dinner. It was only when the woman finally stepped closer to the table, her face catching the light for the first time, that Margaret's carefully rehearsed words died completely in her throat. For a long moment, Margaret simply stared, certain her eyes were deceiving her, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. The woman standing before her, calm and unshaken, dressed in the quiet authority of someone who belonged in that room far more than Margaret did, was Elena. Not the housekeeper Margaret remembered dismissing without a second thought, not the woman she had humiliated across a dinner table months earlier, but someone entirely different, someone whose presence now filled the room with an unmistakable sense of control. Preston's confident expression collapsed into confusion, then alarm, as he glanced between his mother and the woman he had once mocked his brother for even noticing. Elena said nothing for several seconds, allowing the weight of recognition to settle fully over both of them before she finally spoke, her voice as steady and composed as it had always been. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first, decades of composure cracking in an instant. When she finally found her voice, it emerged thin and unsteady, nothing like the commanding tone she had used so effortlessly in her own dining room. She asked, almost pleadingly, how this was possible, how a woman who had cleaned her floors could now be sitting across from her holding the fate of an entire company in her hands. Elena's answer came without anger, without triumph, delivered instead with the same quiet precision she had used the night she defended herself at that painful dinner. She explained, plainly, that she was the sole heir to a shipping and logistics fortune her late father had built decades earlier, a company she herself had rebuilt from near collapse after his death when she was only 24 years old, long before she ever set foot inside the Whitfield estate. What followed left Margaret and Preston in stunned silence. Elena explained that she had not taken the housekeeping position by accident or necessity, but as part of a careful, deliberate investigation into her own father's downfall years earlier, a collapse she had long suspected was connected to a business partnership gone wrong with Harold Whitfield. She had spent months quietly working inside the estate, observing the family from a position no one thought to question, searching for answers about a decision made long before Daniel was even born. What she had not expected, she admitted, her voice softening slightly for the first time, was to fall genuinely in love with Daniel along the way, a complication that had nearly derailed everything she originally set out to uncover. Her hesitation the night he proposed, her guarded silence about her past, all of it suddenly made sense to Margaret in a single, devastating instant. Preston, regaining some of his composure, tried to shift the conversation back toward business, insisting the past had no bearing on the company's present crisis. Elena turned to him then, her expression unreadable, and calmly stated that she had already reviewed, in detail, every reckless decision he had made over the past year, each one contributing directly to the very collapse he now hoped she would help him escape. She did not raise her voice or attempt to embarrass him in front of his mother. She simply laid out the truth with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else, watching as Preston's earlier bravado dissolved into something closer to fear. It became clear, in that moment, that Elena had not walked into this meeting uninformed or unprepared. She understood the company's failures more thoroughly than the two people sitting across from her ever had. Margaret, desperate and unwilling to accept defeat so easily, attempted one final appeal, invoking Daniel's name, suggesting that whatever love remained between them might still be enough to secure the deal without further conditions. Elena's response was calm but unmistakably firm, cutting through the room with a clarity that left no room for argument. She reminded Margaret that she was not there seeking revenge, nor was she there simply to save a family that had once discarded her without hesitation. She explained that years earlier, Harold had attempted to correct the very mistake that had once destroyed her father's business, only to be blocked by his own board before he could follow through. It was that single act of conscience, buried and forgotten by everyone except Elena, that had brought her back into this family's life at all, not sentiment, not nostalgia, but a quiet debt she felt compelled to finally settle. Elena rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the rain-streaked window, her reflection faint against the darkened glass, giving Margaret and Preston a moment to absorb everything she had just revealed. When she turned back to face them, her tone had shifted slightly, no longer explaining, but deciding. She informed them that she was prepared to invest in the company and prevent its collapse, but only under conditions neither of them would find comfortable. Preston, she stated plainly, would be removed immediately from any position involving financial decision-making, required instead to prove himself through smaller, closely supervised responsibilities if he ever hoped to rebuild trust within the company he had nearly destroyed. Margaret, meanwhile, would lose the informal control she had long held over the family trust, the very leverage she had once used to force her own son into an impossible choice. There would be no punishment beyond accountability, Elena explained, but accountability, she made clear, was non-negotiable. Margaret sat in stunned silence. The woman she once dismissed as beneath her family, now dictating the terms of their survival, with a composure Margaret herself had spent a lifetime trying to master. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she had no clever response, no sharp remark to regain control of the conversation. Preston, humiliated but cornered, reluctantly agreed to the terms, understanding that refusal would mean watching everything his father had built collapse entirely under his own mismanagement. Margaret's agreement came more slowly, her pride visibly wounded, but the reality of the situation left her with no real alternative. As the meeting came to a close, Elena gathered the signed documents with quiet efficiency, offering no further comfort, no reassurance, only the same steady composure she had carried since the night she had first walked into that hospital hallway and been turned away without explanation. Daniel learned of the meeting only after it had already concluded, arriving at his father's house later that evening to find Margaret unusually quiet, seated alone in the study with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something closer to humility than anger. When she finally told him what had happened, who the mysterious investor truly was, Daniel felt the room tilt slightly around him, months of grief and confusion suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape that finally made sense. He thought of the phone call he had overheard through the window all those months ago, the strange formality in her voice he had never questioned closely enough. He thought of her calm, unreadable expression at the dinner table, her quiet strength through every hardship that followed. Without waiting for further explanation, he left the house immediately, driving through the same steady rain that had followed them since the beginning of everything, desperate to see her. He found her outside the office building later that night, standing beneath the awning as the storm continued to fall around them, her navy suit now replaced by a simple coat, the composed businesswoman momentarily giving way to someone far more familiar to him. Neither of them spoke right away. Daniel searched her face for some sign of the anger he felt he deserved, but found instead the same steadiness that had first drawn him to her in that overgrown garden so long ago. He apologized first, not for the divorce itself, but for every moment leading up to it, every instance where his silence had failed her before words ever could. Elena listened without interrupting, and when he finally finished, she admitted quietly that she, too, carried blame in all of it, that she should have trusted him with the truth from the beginning instead of testing his family's character in silence, allowing suspicion to guide her instead of honesty. They stood together beneath that awning for a long while, rain falling steadily around them, neither rushing to fill the silence with easy promises or forced resolution. What passed between them instead was something quieter, more honest, an acknowledgement that love alone had never been their problem, that fear, pride, and unspoken truths had done far more damage than either of their hearts ever could. Elena reached out first, her hand finding his, and Daniel felt something settle inside him for the first time in months, not relief exactly, but the beginning of it, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably real. Neither of them spoke of remarriage that night, nor of the company, nor of Margaret's humbled silence back at the house. There would be time for all of that later. For now, standing together in the rain that had witnessed both their darkest and most defining moments, it was enough simply to no longer be standing there alone. In the weeks that followed, Harold's health continued its slow, uncertain recovery, each day bringing small improvements alongside the quiet awareness that his time remaining was limited in ways the family rarely spoke aloud. One afternoon, while sitting alone with Elena on the back porch of the estate, away from Margaret and Preston, Harold finally addressed the truth that had lingered unspoken between them since the boardroom revelation. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood he might not have many more chances to say them. He told her he remembered the partnership with her father clearly, remembered the moment years ago when he had tried to correct the wrong done to him, only to be overruled by board members more concerned with profit than principle. He had let that failure sit quietly in his conscience ever since, never fully forgiven by himself, even before she arrived to remind him of it. Elena listened without interrupting, watching the old man's hands tremble slightly as he spoke, not from illness alone, but from the weight of a guilt carried far too long in silence. When he finally finished, he thanked her, not for the investment that had saved his company, but for giving him the chance to say aloud what he had never been permitted to make right. He told her that whatever years he had left, he intended to spend them differently, more honestly, starting with the way he treated the people his family had once dismissed too easily. Elena reached over and placed her hand gently over his, offering no forgiveness in words, understanding that some debts were better acknowledged than erased entirely. It was enough, for both of them, simply to have finally spoken the truth plainly, after so many years of silence on both sides. Margaret's transformation, unlike Harold's, came slower and far less gracefully, shaped less by peace and more by the uncomfortable reality of losing the control she had spent her entire life clinging to. Stripped of her influence over the family trust and forced to watch her son rebuild a life she had once tried desperately to prevent, she found herself, for the first time in years, without the certainty that had always defined her. It was not until several weeks later, during a quiet visit to Daniel's small apartment, that she finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability neither of her children had ever witnessed before. Standing awkwardly near the doorway, unable to fully meet Elena's eyes, she said, haltingly, that she had been wrong, not just about the marriage, but about the kind of woman she had assumed Elena to be from the very beginning. It was not a full apology, not smooth or rehearsed, but it was honest, and for Margaret, that alone was a kind of transformation no one in the family had expected to see. Daniel and Elena chose to remarry quietly, months later, at the same overgrown greenhouse where he had first proposed to her, now carefully restored with new glass panels and freshly planted rows of flowers that had not grown there in years. It was a small gathering, intentionally so, filled only with the people who had remained honest with them through everything that had happened. Harold sat near the front in a chair brought out specially for him, watching with quiet pride as his youngest son stood before Elena once again, this time with nothing left unspoken between them. Grace, Elena's younger sister, walked ahead of her down the makeshift aisle scattering flower petals, a detail that revealed, for the first time to most of the family, how quietly and consistently Elena had been supporting and raising her sister long before anyone at the estate had ever taken notice. A year later, Daniel's architecture practice had grown steadily, not through his family's influence or Elena's financial backing, but through his own persistence and the reputation he had slowly rebuilt on merit alone, a distinction Elena respected enough never to interfere with directly. Preston, humbled by the consequences of his earlier decisions, worked longer hours than he ever had before, rebuilding trust within the company one small, closely supervised decision at a time, his arrogance replaced gradually by a quieter sense of responsibility. Harold, weaker now but at peace, spent most afternoons seated on the lawn, watching the family he had spent decades building slowly learn to treat one another with the honesty he wished he had insisted upon years earlier. Margaret, though never fully transformed, softened in small, consistent ways that no one had expected, particularly in the quiet moments she now spent with Grace. Moments that seemed to remind her of the kindness she had once buried beneath pride. On a warm afternoon that following spring, Daniel and Elena stood together on the same terrace, where she had once knelt to save an injured bird with nothing more than a folded dish towel and quiet patience. As if answering some unspoken memory, a bird lifted suddenly from the garden wall nearby, wings steady and sure, disappearing into the open sky above them without hesitation. Daniel watched it go, then turned to look at Elena beside him. No longer the housekeeper the family had once underestimated, nor the mysterious investor who had walked back into their lives holding their future in her hands, but simply the woman who had chosen, again and again, to do what was right even when it cost her everything. They tried to force him to choose between his family and his heart. In the end, it was his heart that saved them both.